Read-only domain controllers. One of the new features in Windows Server 2008 is the ability to create a read-only domain controller, or RODC. And as the name suggests, a read-only domain controller is read-only, meaning that it stores read-only copies of the forest objects inside its copy of Active Directory. And this is good, since it will still provide all of the functionality that clients require, but it will be more secure since it can't be written to by malicious users or even well-intentioned users that make bad configuration choices. A read-only domain controller will only accept changes to Active Directory that are replicated to it from other writable domain controllers in your domain. But it won't ever initiate replication the other way around or make changes to any other domain controller. That means that a read-only domain controller is more secure, since it's not possible to make a catastrophic change on the read-only domain controller and then replicate that change to other domain controllers in the domain. Read-only domain controllers also can't hold the operations master roles or be configured as replication bridgehead servers. And if you are planning on putting a read-only domain controller on a server core installation, it's fully supported, and that of course lowers the attack surface of your domain controller, so it's a pretty good candidate for a server core installation. Now, since the read-only domain controller never writes any changes to Active Directory locally, your fully functioning domain controllers will never have to pull updates from it. This means that any updates are only ever going to be coming in one direction, and that's from the writable domain controllers to the read-only domain controller. Now, the read-only domain controller can also be configured to cache credentials locally to help speed things up at the remote site. And as you'll see later on, we have a lot of control over what things will allow to be cached. We can also use role separation to take a user or a group and grant them permissions to manage the read-only domain controller directly, and we'll see how we can take a regular domain user account, grant them local administrative privileges over our read-only domain controller, yet within the greater domain, they're still just a regular unprivileged user. Read-only domain controllers also support a read-only copy of DNS, and installing DNS is good, especially if you're deploying your read-only domain controller in a remote site at the other end of a slow or flaky WAN link, as it will make name resolution for the remote site more reliable. But like with Active Directory, any changes to DNS will need to be replicated from a writable domain controller. Now, you can also filter schema attributes as well to ensure that confidential objects inside your domain are not replicated to your read-only domain controller. So to fully support read-only domain controllers, you'll need to ensure that your forest functional level is at least at Windows 2003 or higher, since read-only domain controllers need to be able to utilize linked value replication, and the domain functional level will also need to be at Windows 2003 or higher, since it's going to need Kerberos constrained delegation. So the minimum is Windows 2003 functional levels for both the domain and the forest, and that means if you have Windows 2000 domain controllers still hanging around, it's time for them to step aside and be upgraded or replaced with 2003 or 2008 ones. Now, in order to deploy a read-only domain controller, you're also going to need to have at least one fully functioning domain controller in the same domain that's running Windows Server 2008, since the read-only domain controller will need to replicate with a Windows 2008 domain controller from the same domain. Now, if you are planning on installing a read-only domain controller in an existing Windows 2003 forest, you're going to need to copy the contents of the Windows 2008 DVD to the server that's currently hosting the infrastructure master role, and then go over to a command prompt and then change into the adprep folder that you've just copied, and then run the adprep command with the RODC prep switch, and that'll prepare the forest for our new read-only domain controller role. Now, once these changes have replicated to the other domain controllers in your forest, you're ready to install your read-only domain controller. Now, in a network that has only Windows 2008 domain controllers, you won't need to worry about this step, as the Active Directory preparation will be done for you when you run the installation wizard. But regardless, we'll show you how to run it in a moment. Alright, so let's take a quick look at how a read-only domain controller works. So in what I'd call a normal standard domain with just a couple of domain controllers, both of them are free to update and make changes to objects inside Active Directory and then update the other domain controller accordingly. So if a change was made to Active Directory on this server DCO2, let's say a new user account's been created, then DCO1 will be updated automatically and both domain controllers will store a record of the new user account. Now if at the same time a security group, for example, was deleted from DCO1, then DCO2 would get that change, and again both domain controllers will reflect these changes. So in this situation, both domain controllers are able to make changes, and that's why Active Directory works in a multi-master fashion. Both domain controllers are able to be the boss, so to speak. When a change is made on either domain controller, the other will reflect the change. Now, this was one of the great improvements over NT4, where we had primary domain controllers and backup domain controllers. Ever since Windows 2000 was released, we've now been able to not just rely on a single machine. And that's also one of the problems with a multi-master database like Active Directory. Since any domain controller can make changes to the entire Active Directory network, a bad or unintended change will replicate to the other domain controllers as well. So for example, if you accidentally delete something in one of the domain controllers, the rest are going to delete the object from their copy of Active Directory as well. So Microsoft have introduced this read-only domain controller which can act to prevent accidental deletions like this, where you might have a novice administrator who makes a change to an object only to have it replicated to all the other domain controllers. With our read-only domain controller, a site still can have the benefit of a local domain controller without all of the additional headaches of management that come along with it. So we'll be adding a read-only domain controller to our lab in a moment on a server called RODC01. And this will mean that our two fully functioning domain controllers here, DCO1 and DCO2, they're both able to update Active Directory and have those changes replicated to each other. And of course, both of these domain controllers can also update the read-only domain controller as well. But the read-only domain controller can't update either of the other domain controllers, and that's exactly what we want. So where should you put a read-only domain controller anyway? Well, there's many different scenarios where a read-only domain controller would be useful, but most likely it's going to be either at the edge of your network or at a remote site where physical security is often lacking. But your placement of the read-only domain controller might also be limited due to the fact that it requires at least one writable Windows 2008 domain controller in the same domain. So that's going to give you something to think about. Alright, well enough talking about it, let's go and install our new read-only domain controller. Now the first thing you'll have to do to prepare for the read-only domain controller is to ensure that you're running both the forest and the domain at the functional level of Windows 2003 or Windows 2008. So we'll go and click on Start, then we'll choose Administrative Tools and we'll launch Active Directory Domains and Trusts. Then we'll right-click on our domain here, winstructorlab.com, and we'll choose Properties. Now down here we can see that we're running both our domain and our forest at the Windows Server 2003 functional level, so we won't need to do anything here, but if you're running Windows 2000, you'll need to raise these to at least Windows 2003 in order to support a read-only domain controller. So we'll click Cancel here, and then we'll right-click on Active Directory Domains and Trusts, and we'll choose Raise Forest Functional Level. And from this drop-down box here, you'll need to select either Windows 2003 or Windows 2008, and then click on the Raise button. Now obviously, since I'm running at Windows Server 2003 at the moment, my only choice here is to go to 2008, as we can't go backwards. Now to raise the domain functional level, we'll right-click on our domain, winstructorlab.com, and we'll choose Raise Domain Functional Level. And again, we get the same sort of screen. Select 2003 or 2008 from the list, and then click Raise. Again, with both our forest and domain functional levels, once you make this change, you can't go back. So make sure you fully understand what you're doing before you commit any changes here. Okay, well, the next thing you're going to have to do is to prepare Active Directory for the read-only domain controller. Well, I'm currently logged onto my domain controller here, so we'll go and click on Start and we'll launch a command prompt. And I'm going to change into my D drive, which is my DVD drive, where I currently have the Windows 2008 DVD in that drive right now. So we'll go and change into the sources directory, followed by the adprep directory. So if you aren't already running only Windows 2008 domain controllers in your forest like I am, you'll need to run the adprep command with the RODC prep switch in order to update the permissions on all of the DNS application directory partitions in the forest. And to run this command, that'll also require you to be a member of the Enterprise Admins group. Now, once you've done all this, if you haven't already installed at least one writable Windows 2008 domain controller in the domain where you plan on installing the read-only domain controller, you'll need to do that first. Now, it can be a full installation of Windows Server or a server core installation, it doesn't matter. As long as it's a writable Windows 2008 domain controller, that's all we need. Okay, now that the prerequisites are out of the way, I've switched over to another server here which we'll use to create our read-only domain controller. So to install our new read-only domain controller, we're going to fire up the server manager by clicking on the little icon here in the quick launch area. And on the left-hand side, we're going to select roles. And over here on the right, we'll choose add roles. Now this will start up the new add role wizard, so we'll click next. And up the top here, we'll choose Active Directory Domain Services and click next again. And we'll get our little Introduction to Active Directory Domain Services screen here, so we'll click next, and then we'll click Install. Now, Active Directory will begin installing, and this will take a little while, so I'm going to pause the video here, and we'll return in a moment. Okay, the installation has finished, and we're reminded once again that we will need to run DC Promo tool to complete this installation of Active Directory. So we'll click this blue hyperlink here, and that'll start up the Active Directory Domain Services wizard, and we've got the option here of using Advanced Mode for installation. So let's check this box, and we'll click Next. Now, I've seen this message many times before, so we're going to click Next again. And as we've seen in our earlier videos, we have two options. Do we want to create a domain controller for a forest that already exists, or will this server be a domain controller in a new forest? Well, in order to install a read-only domain controller, we will need to have already installed an existing Windows 2008 domain controller, and that means we must have an existing forest. So we'll choose here the second radio button to add a domain controller to an existing domain, and we'll click Next. Now we'll need to enter in the name of the domain that this new domain controller is going to be part of, so we're going to enter in winstructorlab.com. And since I'm currently logged on with the local administrator account for our RODC01 machine, we'll need to provide an alternate set of credentials. So we'll click the Set button, and we'll use the administrator account for our winstructorlab.com domain. And we'll enter in the password, and we'll click on OK, and then we'll click Next. All right, now we'll need to select which domain this new domain controller is going to become part of. Now this time, since we've installed a child domain in an earlier video, you'll note here that now we have the option to either install this domain controller into the root winstructorlab.com domain or into the child London domain. And whilst it really doesn't matter which one we choose, let's choose the top one here, winstructorlab.com, and we'll click Next. Now we'll need to select a site for our new domain controller, and we only have the one default first site name here, so we'll leave that and we'll click Next. Okay, now here we can select what additional options we want to install on this domain controller, and up here you can see DNS is already selected, and we'll leave it selected since it's a good idea to have a DNS server installed on this machine as well, since often read-only domain controllers are installed in remote locations, and this means if the WAN connection goes down, then your clients won't be able to perform name resolution, so having a DNS server locally is a good idea. But this DNS server is also going to be read-only, so again, it's directly protected from changes. Now we can also install the global catalog service on this domain controller as well if we like, and that will add in read-only directory partitions of the global catalog, and it will also enable global catalog search functionality. And finally, we can create a read-only domain controller, which is what we're here to do, so we'll definitely select that one, and we'll click Next. Now here we can configure the password replication policy for our read-only domain controller. So what we're basically configuring here is a list of accounts whose passwords will allow to be replicated to our read-only domain controller. You see, since this read-only domain controller is focused on security, by default, it doesn't cache any user's credentials. And this includes administrators, server operators, backup operators, account operators, and any other users or groups that belong to a new group in Windows 2008 called the Denied Read-Only Domain Controllers Password Replication Group. However, any account or group that's a member of the Allowed Read-Only Domain Controllers Password Replication Group will have their password replicated to our read-only domain controller. So let's go and find out what's in these groups. So I'm going to go and click on Start, and we'll go to All Programs, Accessories, and we'll run Remote Desktop Connection. And we'll go and connect to our domain controller DC01. Okay, now we'll go and click on Start, Administrative Tools, and we'll launch Active Directory Users and Computers. Now inside our Users container here, up the top, you can see we have two groups, the Allowed Read-Only Domain Controllers Password Replication Group and the Denied Group. Now if we right-click on the Denied Group first and we'll choose Properties, then the Members tab, in here you can see there's some pretty powerful groups included. We have the Cert Publishers Group, the Domain Admins, the Domain Controllers Group, Enterprise Admin, Group Policy, Creator Owners. We have the Key Distribution Center, Service Account, Read-Only Domain Controllers, and Schema Admins. Now conversely, if we go and take a look at the Allowed Group and the Members tab, you'll notice that by default this is blank, but here you can add in your own accounts and groups that you do want to be replicated. So the main advantage of this is that by denying all of the high-powered accounts, we'll be making our read-only domain controller at the remote site more secure. But if you think about it for a moment, who would be a likely candidate for password replication? Probably the local users at the remote site. So in here, we could add in those people that work at the remote site where we'll be installing the read-only domain controller and have their passwords replicated, and that'll improve logon times. So you can enter in the groups or users that you'd like to be replicated in the same way that normal group membership is configured. We just click Add and then type in the name of the user or group and then click on OK. Alright, well, let's go back to our read-only domain controller. So we'll minimize this. And if you want to add in your own groups directly to this window, you can click on Add and then choose if this is going to be for passwords that you want to allow to be replicated or denied. Now, it doesn't matter what we pick here. Let's just say allowed and we'll click on OK. And then we can just locate the users or groups that we want to add. And we can select them from the list and then click on OK. So once you've made any changes here, if any, we'll click Next. And now we can configure either a user or a group that will allow to be a local administrator of our read-only domain controller. Now normally, in order to manage a domain controller, you'd need to be a member of the Domain Admins group. But with our read-only domain controller, we can configure either a user or a group, but a group is recommended, to have local admin rights on this server without needing to be a domain admin. So why would we want to do this? Well, if you remember that this server is most likely going to be installed at a remote location with probably less security than we might like. But this is still a server, and as such, management tasks will still need to be performed on it. Things like backups, installing new software, installing drivers, even removing Active Directory altogether from the server. So by configuring this section, we can allow a local person to be able to manage this machine with full admin rights. Now sure, they can't create a user account or make configuration changes to Active Directory, but they can otherwise manage the entire server. Now if you don't specify an account here, then only members of the enterprise admins and domain admins groups are going to have full access. So if you want to grant a group or a user local admin rights to this server, we'll click on the Set button, and then we'll just type in the name of a group or a user. Let's just use our user here called Bob, and we'll click on OK, and then we'll click Next. Now once we've created our domain controller inside our existing domain, all of the domain's directory data has to be replicated to this new server that we're building. So we have two ways that we can replicate the data. We can do it over the network from our existing domain controller, or we can do it from media. Now we have seen this before, but in the case of a read-only domain controller that might be located over a slow WAN link, this media option here certainly becomes more attractive. But since I'm sitting on the same local network here, I'm going to leave the default at network, and we'll click on Next. And now we'll need to configure which domain controller will be that replication partner for the installation of our new domain controller. So I'm going to let the wizard choose, and we'll click Next. Now we'll need to specify where we want our database folder, log files, and sysfile folder to be installed. And like we learnt in the previous videos, for best performance, again, it's recommended that these first two, our database folder and log files folder, are stored on their own separate fault-tolerant volume. But again, it's our lab, so it doesn't really matter here. We'll click Next. And now we'll set the administrator password that we'll use to restore our system if we need to boot into directory services restore mode. So I'll enter in my password here. We'll type it in again just to confirm it, and then we'll click Next. All right, well, we've got our summary of what we're about to do, which is to create a new read-only domain controller inside our winstructorlab.com domain. So review this information to ensure that you've got everything in your configuration down correctly, and then we'll click Next, and our installation will begin. Now, as we've seen in earlier videos, this is going to take a while, and it will require our server to be rebooted, so we're going to pause the video here, and we'll return once it's done. Okay, the installation is complete. This server is now a read-only domain controller in our existing winstructorlab.com domain. So we'll click Finish, and then we'll need to restart our server. All right, I've just restarted this read-only domain controller, so if we go and click on Start and choose Administrative Tools, and we'll launch Active Directory users and computers, as like me, you'll probably be pretty keen to see if you can actually create any objects in Active Directory. So we'll expand our domain, we'll go to our users container, and then we'll right-click, and we'll choose a new user. All right, now we'll give this account a name. I'm just going to call it Test, and we'll give our UPN the same, Test. We'll click Next. Then we'll enter in a password, and we'll type it in again to confirm it. And I'm going to leave the rest of the defaults here as they are. We'll just click Next, and then Finish. And there's our new account. But hang on, isn't this server a read-only domain controller? Absolutely it is. So why was I able to create a user account then? Well, I'm glad you asked. Although we're logged onto this read-only domain controller, we're not actually connected to it here in Active Directory users and computers. So if we go and right-click on our domain here, winstructorlab.com, and choose Change Domain Controller, you can see here that we're currently connected to DC01. So if we go and choose our read-only domain controller here from the list and then click OK, we're reminded here that this is a read-only domain controller and we won't be able to make any changes to it. So we'll click on OK, and we'll expand our domain again and go back into our users container. And now we'll right-click, and this time you'll see that we don't have any options to create new objects. So if we go and double-click, say, on any of these groups here, you'll notice that pretty much everything's grayed out, preventing us from making any changes. So if we go and click on Start and choose Administrative Tools, let's quickly launch the DNS console as well, since you'll recall that we chose to install DNS on this server, And that, of course, should be read-only as well. So let's expand our server, our forward lookup zones. We'll select our zone here, winstructorlab.com, and we'll right-click. And you can see here that all of the options for creating new records are grayed out. And like with our Active Directory objects, we'll need to wait for any replication changes from our fully functioning domain controllers in order to update DNS. Now, when it comes time to manage this server, remember we delegated permission to Bob to look after this server, so Bob is going to be able to log onto this server and he'll have full control over everything, with the obvious exception of writing changes to Active Directory. But what if you need to change either the user or group that you delegated permission to? Well, to configure role separation, we'll need to do that from the command prompt. So if we go and click Start, we'll type in dsmgmt, and we'll hit Enter, and this will open up a command window where the first thing we'll need to do is type in local roles and hit Enter. And if we now type in a question mark, you can see all of the available options that we have. So to add in a new user or group to be able to manage our read-only domain controller, we'll need to type in add, followed by the name of the user or group, and then the role that we want to delegate to them. So let's just delete this for now, and we'll type in list roles, and we'll hit enter. And here you can see all of the available roles that we have here. So let's go back, we'll add in a role to a user or group, so we'll type in add, followed by our domain here, which is winstructorlab, and then a group or a username. So let's say we have a group, we'll call the group the good guys. And then we'll need to specify the role that we want to grant them. Well, since they're good guys, they can be administrators. Now, alternatively, we can change this keyword here from add to remove, and then we can take away their permissions as well. All right, now the final thing I want to talk about in this video is password replication policies. And since I'm currently logged onto our read-only domain controller, for this we'll need to go back to our writable domain controller. All right, well, I've just logged on to DC01, which is my writable domain controller. So we'll go click Start, we'll go to Administrative Tools, and we'll launch Active Directory Users and Computers. And then we'll go to the Domain Controllers container. We'll right-click on the computer account for our read-only domain controller, which is RODC01 here, and we'll choose Properties, then the Password Replication Policy tab. Now in here, you can see the default groups that are either allowed to have their password replicated or denied from having their passwords replicated, and we saw this during the installation of our read-only domain controller. And down the bottom, over here, you can see that we can add or remove groups. But if we click on the Advanced button, we're able to view the accounts that are being stored on the read-only domain controller, and here you can see that we have the password for the Key Distribution Center Service account and the computer account for our read-only domain controller, and we can see things like when the password was last changed and when the password expires. Now down the bottom here, we could export this window to either a CSV file or a text file if we like. And if we click on the Pre-populate Passwords button, we can then add in users or computer accounts that we'd like our read-only domain controller to store the passwords locally for. Now, obviously a good candidate for this would be those users that are in the remote site. So if you want, you can add them in here. Now, when you do add in users and computer accounts here, behind the scenes, the read-only domain controller will replicate and cache locally the passwords of those users and computers before they try to log on. Now, this will not only save time and make their logon process quicker, it also means that if the WAN link goes down, since the passwords are being cached locally, then those users will still be able to log on. Now, if we select the drop-down box at the top here, we can also view accounts that have already been authenticated to the read-only domain controller. And we can see those accounts listed here. Now, finally, at the top here, we have another tab, the Resultant Policy tab. And if you're at all wondering if a specific user or group is allowed or denied to have their password replicated to our read-only domain controller, we can find out here. We'll click Add, And then we can browse for the user. Let's just type in Bob here and click on OK. And we can see that Bob in this case is being denied from having his password replicated. So that's a quick and useful method of finding out what users or groups are being affected. Now, even though a read-only domain controller offers much more in the way of security than a writable domain controller, there are certain things that even Microsoft can't do. So in the event that your read-only domain controller is physically stolen, you should proceed to delete the computer account from within Active Directory users and computers. So we'll right-click on it and we'll choose Delete, and we'll say Yes here. Now here you can see we've got the option of resetting all of the passwords for those user accounts that were being cached on our read-only domain controller. We could also reset all the passwords for the computer accounts that were being cached. But do take note of this warning here though. This will remove the computers from the domain and they'll have to be rejoined. Now finally down the bottom here, the default is to export a list of all the accounts that were being cached. So we'll just enter in a path here for where we want the file to be created, or we could just uncheck this box and we could choose to view the list, and we've seen this all before. And then when we're ready, we can hit delete, and those passwords are then going to be reset. So even if someone steals our read-only domain controller and somehow manages to crack those cached passwords, they won't work on our network anyway, since they'll all have been reset. In this video, we've seen how to create a read-only domain controller, which, as we learned, offers better security for locations where physical security or a reliable and knowledgeable administrator is lacking. We also saw how we can configure role separation to allow other users permissions to manage our read-only domain controller, and then we looked at how you can configure the password replication policy as well. Now finally, we talked about how you can ensure that in the event that your read-only domain controller is stolen, that your passwords are all reset